Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. This is a conversation with David Jamieson. I've wanted to meet David, at least virtually, for quite a while. I read a marvelous chapter that he wrote along with Jackie Milgram in the Palgrave Handbook of Organizational Change Thinkers. The chapter is called Peter B. Vail, A Life in the Art of Managing and Leading. In this conversation, though, we focus first on a study that he has just completed and is disseminating around the world called Use of Self, directed to consultants in organizational behavior development and change. He's a wonderfully easy man to speak with. That's probably why I talk too much in this conversation, because he brought so much joy to the thoughts that I was having about practice, about Peter, and about how much we have to learn about leadership. And he has some really good ideas about how to enrich that. So here is David Jamieson. David Jamieson.
Yes.
Anyone who's listening who can get to Google should Google David Jamieson and look at an impressive resume and a body of work. But this conversation is not about that, but it is impressive as hell, Dave. All you've accomplished and what you continue to accomplish going forward may come up in our conversation. But one of the most remarkable things that I've learned in a very short time getting acquainted with Dave is the study that he and his colleague did, and he will probably tell you a bit about that. I had this right in front of me. It's a report called The Global Use of Self, UOS, Research Project with Mei-Yang Judge. My main accent doesn't allow me to pronounce anything but Smith, Jones, and Fearon, and David Jamieson.
That's good. That's good.
So why don't we start telling us a little bit about not just the study, but what's coming from it in your direct experience, the work you did, they did, or have you been getting some feedback on it?
Yes. Yeah, there's a couple different things, Dave, that have come out of it. I mean, first of all, because it has been shared, because the data came from around the world and it's been shared back around the world, we've had numerous emails from different people about, one, how important they think it is, how wonderful it is that we've made more clarity on something that is a bit ambiguous to a lot of people, like how do you work on yourself, and so people either think about serious therapy versus self-development processes, and but there's been great feedback to it, and there has been a little bit of an uptick in organizations or people wanting to include like a webinar or something on it to share with other people. So that may happen. And Mei-Yang Judge and I, who have been working on this for almost 3 years, and she's just a wonderful person to work with as well. She's a very senior OD consultant around the world and has always been as interested as I have been in the use of self as an important concept, which simply means all the education and all the tools and all the methods we have are nothing in comparison to how we behave and act and influence the work that we're trying to do. And that self as instrument is the other phrase that gets used, and it's how critical and central you are as an instrument in change work. And so that's that, but that comes from the OD field. What's really fascinating me in the last almost 10 years now is how come use of self isn't discussed and worked on with leaders? And it's critical to leaders. And so yes. I have been starting to write more on that, and I'm trying to focus some of the webinar work around speaking really to leaders, not just to change agents. That's where I hope it goes next.
No, that's a great direction. And I've told others since Peter passed away in March that I have this headset on, and I have one more earphone that goes straight into my mind. And that comes from Peter, straight where he is. And the first thing he would say, well, leadership is change. That's it. The practice of leadership is change. He said that in several of our podcast conversations. But secondly, he would be going, yes, absolutely, yay. Because
That's great.
Leading, while the OD practitioner is purposefully installed in a system, the intention of those who did the installation to come out of it better and the system healthier, or however you characterize it, it's the same in my mind to most of the people I've known who were effective as leaders. And they are leaders largely because they instill trust, they earn trust, they act in a way that, the word these days you hear a lot is authentically.
Yeah, right.
But tell me more about your thoughts on how this use of self will be feathering into leadership thought.
Well, there's a couple of different ways I see this having the most immediate impact, and let me just preface it by one of the mutual connections that Peter and I both shared, but not when we knew each other, was Bob Tannenbaum at UCLA.
Oh, yeah.
And Bob was one of the very few people in the founding of OD that always emphasized use of self and always used use of self when he was advising leaders and students and everybody else. So he's the one who implanted that for me. And I know when I talked with Peter, he said when Peter was there, that was where he got the in-depth understanding of how important use of self was in any work we were doing. And I remember Bob even talking about, he used to have executives come and visit. This is after he retired, but executives would come and spend a day or two with their wives or their husbands, and then Bob and his wife would have them for a couple of days, and that was his work. He was doing coaching with them in all the different times, and actually working with the partners as a way, and again, because everything he saw through the lens of use of self, it would always be not what's wrong with your team and not what's wrong with your organization, but what part are you playing in the results you're getting? That was always a critical message. And
wow.
And so as I go forward with bringing use of self, hopefully more into the leadership realm, I would like to work with more leaders in both group and individual coaching activities, and really bring a different set of questions to their analytical minds, and a different set of questions to their profit and loss and spreadsheet thinking, And so that would be where I think use of self has a potential to change the nature of how leaders interact and impact on other people. And in my own years of consulting, quite a few years, I've seen so many leaders who just walk over people, or who say things and never realize the impact that it has down the line. And so I think that awareness at the leader level could really help improve what people are actually doing as leaders.
Do you think that given these enormously different circumstances, which level a lot of different hierarchical organizations overnight, in that they've sent a lot of people away and suddenly they are looked at for all kinds of reassurance that things will eventually be rebuilt. I mean, this is an extremely vulnerable point for those who are leaders, managerial leaders, as Peter would classify them, because they have responsibility for the functioning of the organization and not just making influential acts. So do you sense that there could be more receptivity now for these people to be more aware of how important their selfhood is to themselves and others?
Yeah, I think here's the other thing is, if you watch leadership development and leadership writings over the years, in the last 10 or 15 years, self-awareness, mindfulness, and emotional intelligence have snuck into the leadership realm. In other words, there are more people in leadership development work who are including things like that. But
Yes.
most of that means take an instrument, get your results, and understand them. So that what we're doing is we're bumping up awareness a little bit. What is usually missing, and why the phrase use of self means something more to me than just self-awareness, is because you also have to take that data and then work in your real world and see how you're behaving, and whether you're behaving in ways that get the proper impact that you hope it gets,
Yeah.
or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when it doesn't, that's an opportunity to talk about what could I do differently? How could I talk with my team differently? How could I make my presentations different? And what impact might that have? And that's where I think the missing link is on the action side.
Yeah.
So
I think there has been a steady drumbeat for instruments,
yeah,
surveys and techniques like that to kind of pull out from people some significance of who they are and how they're leading. But it's pretty easy for them to dash through those results,
yep,
as 360s or whatever you may say, and then
yep,
go on their merry way. What I think Peter would say is that he would agree with you, and then let me tell you the way of thinking that Peter started with when he started writing on practice back around 2011. And so very early in his essay development, now pretty much a full manuscript of thought on conjectures on the nature of practice, he said, practice is the conscious ability fairly consistently to produce intended results. And that's the first part of it.
I like that.
But that conscious ability to fairly consistently produce results, the leader you've talked about, not seeing results for himself, herself, or his organization, or the organization, has to consciously set those results in their mind. But then he says, and to do so across a range of circumstances. So he always talked about, the white water, the changing, the range of circumstances. And the key word there for me is range. Because, we could set our minds to be very narrowly focused and try to lead others through that tiny little crack in life.
Yeah.
Or we can intentionally try to expand our awareness of circumstances. So that's something that when I was teaching full time, I tried to get even the sophomores in the intro to management class to recognize, these ever expanding outer rings. You've seen the old models of, the various environments in which they're working, and to do so while growing and changing oneself to meet changing circumstances in which one's practice exists. So once you set those intentions for results, it begins to define practice, and then you become aware of these circumstances and you want to expand your awareness, and then while growing and changing oneself. Now we're back to your study, we're back to your Dave. So that's and that way of thinking kept coming back again and again as we talked over various conjectures about practice. But what do you think?
And this is a connection I did not know previously, but it really fits so well, because I was listening on one of the podcasts about his description of what you just read to me, and I couldn't help but begin to think about what are the core concepts that I write about in use of self. And just listen to these kind of words for a moment. Intention, self-development practices, reflective practices, learning in each situation as ways to decide whether I'm having the impact I wish or a different impact.
Beautiful.
All of those were like core, and they fit that definition of practice so much. And I never knew that. I never knew that before, the last few days. So
I'm thinking that you said that Tannenbaum and Peter had, Tannenbaum and Peter had, a formative time together, and Peter was very good at tracing all kinds of influential thought and persons in his life all the way up to the present, and but I think this notion of self as one's purpose, one's job in a way, stuck with Peter all the years I knew him. If you read, I'm sure you have the various books that he's done, particularly Learning as a Way of Being, where he made an emphatic case that we are responsible for our own learning. Schooling is a nice thing, good thing, but it's not learning per se. That notion of constantly growing oneself to meet these circumstances. And the other key thing that I picked up already in skimming through your wonderful report was that being present in the moment and being able to manifest a useful choice in the moment of what to say, what to do, that efficacy at the point of action, which Peter liked to quote, is very much tied into your work, I think, Dave.
And that is one of the hardest parts of it, because you're in a situation and your stress level goes up. And so all of a sudden you're a little distracted from being present in the moment. And so what happens is you lose choices when that occurs, and you start acting habitually. You fall back to what's already comfortable. And that is what I've worked with dozens of students on that issue when we've been trying to teach them the concept. It's like you don't automatically go to where you naturally tend to go. You need what we call that the executive pause. It's the brief moment that says, what are my choices here and which one am I going to choose? And that is where, so I have this is diagrammed now in some models and stuff. They weren't directly from the report. They were done before the report, but just ways to help people in their own practice to think about, how am I showing up, and am I making choices around my intention? Or am I just habitually doing the same thing that I did last Wednesday in the meeting? And that's the hope.
And the answer to that is yes, I am, because I think most of us do. So you're right.
That's right.
It is that deeper desire to achieve ever, and what we added later, increasingly challenging results that would make any students or anyone I'm helping say, "Oh, you mean I can't just do what I've already done before a little differently?" No, if you're in the moment, you're in the middle of a living system, as you guys wrote, and it's flying around you, and people are looking at you, and your heart's beating, and their ears are perked up. You know, you can't pull out the manual, and yet you can't pull it out of your butt either. And I think
that's right. That's right.
Peter's talking in my head because he loved those kind of little twists. But so,
I know.
What has worked for you primarily as you've tried to help anyone, particularly students, become more comfortable at being uncomfortable?
I think what's really helped the most is the value of feedback. I think having people who have credible voice in your head that can give feedback, and I think just getting feedback through a performance appraisal or whatever may or may not have any value at all to somebody. But it's hearing the way you show up and what people saw that you didn't see. You know, it comes from the old Johari window, which says there are things about ourselves that we know, and there are things about ourselves we don't know. Well, I now raise the importance of feedback, even though it's been part of my life forever. I now think when people aren't asking for it, there's lots of people who won't tell somebody who's an authority. So you have to invite feedback, and then you have to reflect on it. You have to say, well, that's interesting. All those people saw me act a certain way in that meeting, and I was not even conscious of that. Now that's what you need to learn, because that gives you choice. Without that, you're operating off of no choice. And I think that's where these concepts come together for me. And and even in terms of the way in which practice is being described in this podcast series and stuff is really important, because there's a couple of things that entered my mind as I was listening to what is practice. Okay.
Mhm.
And it seems to me that the story in one of them about the person who had a job and wondered if it was a practice or not.
Yep.
And I was thinking how common that is. So a job seems to be something you're doing for pay,
That's right.
but it may not draw who you are into the work.
Right.
And so I think that then there's something like it's working on something where your heart and mind are connected in it. In other words, it's drawing on your passion to become a practice.
That's right.
And therefore, a lot of people that are out in the workforce today are not working on a practice for them, but there's a whole bunch of others that are,
Yeah.
and so it reminds me of Jeff Bellman when he used to write about consulting many years ago. He called it a calling. And
Yeah.
and the calling is a similar concept, I think.
Yeah.
And so when we have a practice, it means we care about the quality of it rather than how many pieces of paper did I move across my desk today.
Yeah. If you apply that to the Gallup studies of employee engagement that have been going on for
Yes.
over 30 years, and you see this is prior to the pandemic, but you see these very troubling numbers that maybe 17% of respondents across a whole variety of circumstances, nations, and all the rest are fully engaged in the work. And my conjecture there is, and therefore they have a practice way of doing that work. They see that work is developing them while they're doing the work. And then there's a bunch in the middle. And then there are a whole lot of people being paid, or were being paid for this, for basically mailing it in. And
that's right.
As a good old Yankee, I get upset. Hey, I want $1 worth of effort for 50 cents. So there's also a way of moving this attention to self, this awareness of self, to a larger segment beyond the conventional leaders. But the other thing is that what Peter really helped me understand, and I think this goes to what I mentioned earlier to you before we started, of his wonderful curiosity about people, and his way he put people at ease, so that he could learn more from them. And that is that there is a potential, there's a seed for practice in everyone, and if you could help them, no matter what the work is, find something about the work that they feel eventually is going to develop them more strongly in their identity, then they might be more aware of the circumstances and changing circumstances, and see that a job can provide growth, but it's here. You have to make that determination for yourself. Now, real quick segue. I just saw the carpenter who's working on some renovation outside my house come by. He's been at the job 50 years. He comes from our town, New Hartford. Tremendous reputation. It's taken me almost 2 years to get him to come up to us for our job because he's so much in demand, but not right now. But he's doing. But my point about mentioning Pete the carpenter is that I watched him. He's using my money, so I'm watching him, but I'm not hovering. I'm admiring the way it's almost like he dances, the way he moves, and he sees this has got to come together before we can do this. But he finds the problems in that piece of building that he's working on in my house, and he gets right into it. And he said, "Isn't this interesting? I haven't seen this before." He showed that to me once, and I go, "Oh God, what are you going to show me, Pete?" And it was a pretty bad piece of work that someone had done on this before we bought the house. So, but then he was like, "I really haven't seen this." He says, "I have to figure out a way I don't want to cost you a lot of money. And you've heard good people, you realize, say, I don't want to cost you a lot of money here. Let me think if there's something I can do. Maybe there's something I can not rig up, but maybe there's something I can adapt. And that's a key word to this problem. So I go, yes. So what Peter and I said is that anything can be a practice if people make that a chosen way of behaving. But in the OD practitioner world, and Peter was very interested, he's very active in the OD network in the day and all of that. So he had a particular, I think, love in his heart for people who are putting themselves out into the world like you are and your colleagues. Let's see. I think I've told all kinds of stories, and this is supposed to be about you. But what do you think of that notion that there are people who will do a job, and then there are people who do a job but do it in a practice way, and then eventually becomes, this is what I was trying to get at, identify themselves as that practice. For a quick example, I tried playing golf after never playing for 40 years. So I was playing at golf. But eventually, I started to actually enjoy being a golfer. You see the difference?
Yes.
And so that translation over to I got to get back out on that golf course. We can't yet here in Connecticut without all kinds of restrictions.
No,
but the difference is now I'm a golfer.
Exactly.
But what makes people say, I think I'd like to be a change agent. I'd like to be an OD practitioner, right?
Yeah.
What do you picked up? Because I saw you had a wonderful survey of people, including their qualitative comments about what it meant to them to be an OD practitioner.
Yes. Well, I think what makes the difference in any job is a couple of things. One is when I get as much out of it as the people I'm serving, then that's one kind of connection that I think makes a difference. And I learned that when I started my career right out of a doctoral program and wanted to be a consultant. I wanted to do consulting. I didn't have the foggiest idea what that actually was going to mean, but that's where I started. And what I found was I would get involved in situations and I would care about whether or not I was providing a service that was valuable to somebody. And obviously I wasn't every single time. So the feedback and the learning process was really critical. And over a number of years, then that kept improving my expertise in that role. So then the second thing is there are intrinsic rewards while you're doing it. It's not how much did you make and what your title is. There are intrinsic rewards occurring while you're doing the work. And I think that's another way to think about. So like your carpenter story, I know an auto mechanic that's a lot like that.
Yeah.
And some auto mechanics love their work so much because they know there are 5 different ways that something may be happening, but they'll listen to both the noise and look at the parts to figure it out. So it's like it's integrated with it's integrated with their expertise, and it's integrated with their desire to come up with a solution for their client.
Yeah.
And I find consulting fits that model perfectly because the ones who have a hammer and just keep using it over and over again is not even what I think of as consulting. Consulting is you face a situation and it has more unknowns in it than not. And part of it is a learning process, and part of it is partnering with the people in the system, and part of it is coming up with new solutions. So to me, the whole process does not need to feel repetitive. And yet for some people who do the same thing every week with a different client, they are very repetitive.
Yeah.
But I don't consider that consultation anymore.
That is quite a different, that moves more over to training or worse on indoctrination. But there are plenty of folks over the years that I've been in management education who have whole books of methodologies and tools, and
Yeah.
I respect them, but I've noticed in being on the board of at least one of those kind of consultancies that
Yeah.
what their people were doing when they went out into these companies was they had their methodologies, they had their tools, but before very long, what they really were being asked for was what you just said.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Step beyond the tools for a minute and look at this situation. Look at this customer cluster and problems.
Right.
And so, in a way, I was saying as an overseer, saying, "Great, capture that, bring it back. We can alter the methodology." But it became such almost sacred methodology in some ways to the people doing it that they didn't quite get that part. But now it turns out that the person who ran that organization is now basically doing consulting. He knows the methodology, he's written the books, but he's found out that it's a lot more satisfying to do what you say. A lot, and because he loves walking the tightrope. He likes working without a net now. He always had his bag of tricks. Now he's working without a net. So
and I think it has to do with human development cycles too. I mean, I think it means when you move from being functional at something and having studied it, for example, and I know how to do it, that's not the same as having efficacy or mastery. It's not the same as moving up the developmental cycle. And I think until you get there, it's very hard to understand why I get so upset when I'm on my third step of a 5-step model, but the people are not responding the way I was told they would. I don't know what to do next. See what I mean? And we have too many people out there managing change that way, and I can't stand it sometimes. But
some of those folks might argue, well, they've taken our usual time of engagement and they've condensed it down. They're saying, okay, we're going to give you 24 hours. I'm stretching the point to be wonderful. So you've got to show them the 5 steps, and you cram it into 24 hours. And of course, your heart sinks because you're cheapening the whole experience. But I've heard that that's sort of the commercialization of practitioner work has made it very tough because you don't even get a chance to learn them, know them.
That's right.
To develop any kind of social bonds. Have you seen that at all, or am I just looking at my little slice of experience?
No. That's very true. I mean, in fact, more people are trying to cram more in shorter time frames than ever, but expecting better results. And the two don't go together. I mean, I can do, if something takes 8 hours to get across to people and for them to internalize, and then they say, no, we only going to give you 4, then I can say, I will be able to share all the concepts. I do not know whether it'll become internalized or not, because you just cut it in half. Now, if we could do that and add an assignment or do that and add some activity to those people, maybe you'll get the right result.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point. I mean, the people who are designing and planning this stuff and paying for it are trying to truncate the heck out of everything. And because, everything's so fast now and everything has to be done yesterday and all that stuff. That's no excuse, but that's exactly what people are trying to do, and yet they're not getting better results that way. They're just redoing things over and over again.
And these times are certainly not. They're not going to reward going, back to old habits of any sort from any kind of institution. Right. So there may actually be a reopening of the time allowed for people to come in and do a really constructive intervention, or not even, that's not the right word. Just be engaged with people to help them see their way forward in a new way. But as we're moving on to the edge of my time allotment here, because I've been loving this conversation, and I hope you are. Let's see if we can have one more Peter Vale story.
Great.
So as you were listening to the podcast and hearing Peter, what do you feel when you hear someone like him think aloud?
One of the things that I hear and I've respected about him is in everything he's saying, it's not final or certain. It's exploratory. Everything he's saying, I think this might be like this, and that makes me think about that. And he's making connections in the moment, which is very different, which is a form of humility. It says, I'm exploring this, and I'm talking about it with you, which is a lot different than here's the answer.
Yeah.
And so that was both him as a person, but it was also his style of inquiry, I think.
Yes.
That really came through that way. And the other thing I would say, and it shows up a little in the podcast, but it also showed up whenever you talk to him. There would always be a touch of humor
Yes.
in almost any conversation that you'd have.
Yeah.
And I love that, and I think I do that a lot myself, and I think that there's a combination there that really is good. And but I noticed that a lot with him. He's clearly a deep thinker. I think the types of questions he asks, although Bob Tannenbaum and he are very, very different people, but it reminds me of what I respected about Bob. Bob would ask questions that I would have never thought about. and I think Peter asks questions that I may never have thought about.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Those are great reflections. As we were working on initially, what Peter had written out were his notes on practice, and then when we started talking and recording our talk, he said, to your point, Dave, he said, let's not call them theories at all. Let's call our ideas conjectures. He was very, very firm on that. As he said, they're conjectures. And that's to your point. Let's see, let's put it out there, and let's see what other people think. So we had 30 of them by the time he finished this rough manuscript before we started podcasting. But they were all in a said in a conjectural way.
Yeah.
The other thing is, if you listen a little bit, I hope you do, to a point of his humor, when I started bringing practitioners, my former students mainly, to have conversation with Peter, because he was getting pretty exhausted just talking about, the conjectures on practice, and he was getting exhausted, period. And so I sensed that he would really perk up if he had a chance to have a three-way conversation. So the 5 or 6 people who had that opportunity with Peter, and he was looking forward to April, when we were going to have conversations with Eric Dent and Kathy Ross and others. He was really looking forward to it. Anyway, the point is that when you listen to him, and they would talk, and then he would chuckle. That chuckle, it was so spontaneous and real. And feedback I'd get afterwards, I was call up and say, how did you like talking with Peter? I basically think he walks on water. And they would say, yeah, but he was real. He was there. He was present. He listened, and then and I loved the fact that he laughed. I was so relieved when he laughed, but it wasn't it was just that just sort of wonderful chuckle. So Dave, thank you for this chance to honor the work that Peter and I started. We're going to keep it going, and I'd love to see if there's any way possible that we can dovetail more of our thoughts on practice and work on practice.
I hope we can too, David. I hope we can too.